pleasure. But today we are starting a new series. It is looking at the books of 1 and 2 Samuel, which was originally one book, but it had to be split up due to scroll size issues. So we're looking at these two books over the next few weeks. These books contain some Sunday school classics, some of which the kids have started to look at in their groups. We have got God calling Samuel. We've got David and Goliath. We've got David and Jonathan. We've got David and Bathsheba. But really, these books are books about characters. We follow the lives of these key characters to help us know and understand and learn something of their highs and their lows, and how their evolving relationship with God gives us some things that we can pick up and learn from. We will spend time in this series thinking lots about Samuel, about Saul, and about David. But today we're just in the first couple of chapters. They kind of set the tone for the rest of the whole story, not just the story of Samuel, Saul and David, but they also foretell something much greater of God's plan. If you have time, I'd really recommend checking out the Bible Project on YouTube. It gives a great overview of both of these books. In these chapters, the early chapters, just chapter 1 and 2, we meet some other characters. And I just want to think about the 4 of them today. Briefly, we are going to consider 3 who got it wrong and show us something of what not to do. And then we'll spend a little bit longer focusing on the person who got it right and helps us as well. First of all, we read about a chap called Elkanah. Now, he is a loving and loyal chap. He seemed to treat people pretty well, but was also quite prone to missing the point. He reminds me a little bit of me. Because in verse 8, oh dear, he says to his wife, "Why are you crying?" And then he says, "I know, you need some food. Why don't you have some food? That will cheer you up." Doesn't work, because then he kind of says to her, "You're still sad. What's wrong? Am I not enough?" Now, when I said that to Miriam, yeah, that does remind me of you, actually. I'm paraphrasing those verses, but we've got this man who is well-intentioned, but he gets it wrong, probably on a regular basis. I'm really encouraged, though, that we have these characters in the Bible. They're real-life people, but we do need to try not to be like Elkanah. Then we come across Peninnah. She appears rather competitive about the number of children she can produce. And honestly, as we read in the passage, she is a bit mean. It says in verse 6 that she kept provoking Hannah, who was her rival, and she provoked her in order to irritate her. Now, this wasn't a one-off occurrence. It says in the Bible it went on year after year. Maybe she was jealous of Elkanah's love for Hannah, because it does say that Elkanah gave Hannah extra portions of food, so maybe that was an issue. But I don't know, it gives us this real life example of a person who gets it wrong, but also it gives us a helpful example of how to respond when someone is getting it wrong, and as I said, being mean. However, we need to try not to be like Peninnah. And then we have Eli, a priest, therefore a man of God. But then we read in verse 12, "As she," that was Hannah, "continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart. Only her lips moved. Her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be a drunken woman and said to her, 'How long will you go on being drunk? Put your wine away.'" Now, here we have a person who I think perhaps should know better. But Eli is human like the rest of us, and therefore he is prone to judging others before he has the full picture. Something that probably many of us have done, and then we swiftly realise that we should avoid that at all costs. So we need to try not to be like Eli. However, let's be encouraged, because not just because when we get things wrong, it doesn't mean that God doesn't use us. As we see from this story, Eli, God has good and great plans for Eli. He takes somebody who's a bit judgmental and he uses them to unfold his plan. So we don't want to be like those. Then we come to Hannah, who is this wonderful contrast, whose example we can see and we could try and follow. We want to try and be like Hannah. Hannah is faced with one of life's great challenges, and her response to that is real, but it's also quite profound. Hannah was unable to have children, which is not an unfamiliar situation that we hear about in the Old Testament. But it's not an unfamiliar situation that many people face today. In adoption circles, Mim and I have met many people who are facing this heartbreaking reality. Today, on a day like Father's Day, we do understand that celebrating all things fatherhood can be really tricky for lots of us based on our experiences or lack of experience with our earthly fathers. But it can also be really tricky and hard for anybody that wants to, but maybe is struggling to have children. The reality for Hannah in her culture was that being unable to conceive would have actually had her considered a failure and a social embarrassment. I was struck that even in the midst of this heartbreak, other elements of life for Hannah didn't stop. She still had to cope with kind of the normal challenges too. She had to endure people's judgment like Eli. And she had to deal with people who didn't understand like Elkanah. And actually she had to deal with people who were just outright mean like Peninnah. And this wasn't, as I said, a one-off. It went on year after year. I think it can be the same for us too, that even when we're facing the big challenges of life, we also still need to be able to navigate the kind of normal day-to-day challenges of life as well. The mundane stuff doesn't stop just because we're facing something more significant. I wonder how you would have responded in Hannah's situation. Many people's response would be that of bitterness, anger, discouragement, probably retaliation. I'm sure Hannah had times where she felt all of those things. But we do see in her this really helpful way of responding when we're journeying through tough, hard times. The overarching thing to take away from Hannah's response is that she brings it all to God. She brings it all to God. As I was preparing, a little phrase stuck in my mind, and it was that Hannah worshipped in her waiting. Hannah worshipped in her waiting. In verse 19, after this interaction she's had with Eli, it says she rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord. We know that she was visiting the temple, part of sacrifice, but worship, even in the midst of this challenge that was seemingly going on year after year after year, Hannah worshipped in her waiting. I read a commentary in preparing for this talk, and it again used a phrase that I found really helpful. It said that Hannah prays gritty, persistent, and anguished prayers of faith. In verse 10 we read, she was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Actually, Hannah brought the reality of her situation that was hard and tough and painful and a struggle. And actually, it didn't stop her praying. It didn't stop her bringing that to the Lord. Even when she was experiencing pain, confusion, frustration, and grief, she brings all of that to God. In response to Eli thinking that she was drunk in verse 15, Hannah says, no, I'm a woman who is deeply troubled. I haven't been drinking beer or wine. And then she uses this phrase that I love. She says, I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. This is a phrase that we hear David using quite often in Psalms or in Lamentations. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. What does that mean? I think it means that she was pouring out her whole heart. She was praying, yes, but I think she was weeping. She was bringing her whole and broken self before God in prayer, in worship, in conversation. I think she was being real with him, saying how she really felt, pouring out her heart. And as I was preparing this preach, I was acutely aware that this is an absolute classic case of somebody who absolutely doesn't practice what they preach. And it might be the case for you too, because when I start using phrasing like pouring out your heart to God, you might just think, that's not really me. And I wonder why that is. Maybe it's our culture. Maybe the stiff upper-lipped Brits that don't actually wear our heart on our sleeve or really often share how we're actually feeling. How are you doing today? Yeah, I'm fine, thank you. Today, and you? Yeah, no, I'm fine. Good. Our culture doesn't lend itself to pouring out our hearts to anything. Maybe we don't give time and space for that to happen. I'm really aware that even on a Sunday afternoon as we come to church, there's lots of things that we have to do and lots of things we have to share. And often that means we don't have extended times of prayer or worship. Maybe giving space in that context to pour out our heart to God. Maybe that's something we need to think about. For us gents, then I think we have this case of toxic masculinity, where we are raised to believe that real men don't cry, that men aren't showing emotion, because if we show emotion, that means we're showing weakness, that actually we are raised in a certain way, in a certain culture that actually says it's not really okay to not be okay, particularly as men. That's something I think we need to be aware of and think something we need to be challenging. Maybe we don't pour out our heart to God because we don't want to offend or upset God. Maybe we feel that actually if we tell God how we really feel, he's going to, not listen to that or be upset with that. Or actually we're kind of saying to God, we're stuck in this place. Are you listening? And we don't want to upset or offend him. I would say that I believe that God is big enough and would welcome us pouring out our hearts to him. There are just a few reasons why maybe we don't pour out our heart to God. There may be many more that I haven't touched on, but whatever the reasons are, I would suggest that none of them are good enough for us not to do it. Let's be a church family that encourages one another to make space and find time to bring all of ourselves to God, not just the bits that we are happy for people to see on a Sunday afternoon. So Hannah, a great example of pouring out her heart to God. We hear and we read on that God heard and God responded. He answered her prayer and she gave birth to a son and she named him Samuel, which means God has heard me. That could have been the end of the story, couldn't it? That happy ending. God has answered the prayer. So often we ask God for something, he hears, he responds, we thank him, and then we move on to the next thing. But actually we learn again from Hannah, her response is different. We read about that in verse 27 and 28. For this child I prayed, and the Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. Hannah gave Samuel back to God and trusted Samuel to Eli. Her grief was turned to joy, and her despair was replaced with hope. And once again, in that place, she prays out to God. She prays this wonderful prayer, poem, song. It's a prayer of rescue and rejoicing. But it also is a prayer that actually sets the tone for the rest of the story, the rest of the story of Samuel, Saul, and David. It introduces us to some key themes that we'll explore over the next few weeks. What are those themes that we hear about in her prayer? The themes are this: that God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. That despite pain and in some cases evil, God is at work. And that one day God will raise up an anointed king. So what I want to do now is I want to read this amazing prayer together, and then we will respond in our own time of worship. And perhaps now is a time that you can pour out your heart to God, knowing that God hears your cry. He hears your pain. He might hear your anguish, your frustration. But I think he wants to hear that. He wants us to bring all of ourselves to him, not just the bits that we are happy for other people to see and hear. So let's take a moment to read this amazing prayer of Hannah, and then we'll worship together. She says this: "My heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth derides my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is none holy like the Lord. There is none beside you. There is no rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let not arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are broken, but the feeble bind on strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honour. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful ones, but the wicked shall be cut off in darkness. For not by might shall man prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed." Father God, I want to thank you for the example of Hannah. Thank you that we can read in your words this story of someone who is so real, experiencing such pain and heartbreak. But in that place, Father God, we can learn from her example to pour out our hearts to you. I pray that you would help us to do that. I pray that you would take away any barriers to that. I pray now as we worship together that you would come and you would just, this would be a time and a space where we can be honest and open with you, and we can bring all of ourselves to you. So come by the Spirit, I pray. Amen.